The cave mouth is barely visible from the jungle floor, just a dark slash in the limestone cliff, overgrown with vines and moss, hidden by decades of vegetation. Inside, in the permanent twilight 20 feet from the entrance, there's a shelf carved into the rock. On that shelf sits a rusted tin can, a rotted leather boot, and 3 spent rifle cartridges arranged in a precise row. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda placed those cartridges there in 1952, marking another year of war. He would arrange similar markers for 22 more years, alone in the Philippine jungle, fighting a war that had ended before most of those years began. His story became famous, the Japanese holdout who surrendered in 1974, who couldn't believe the war was over, who kept fighting for 3 decades after Hiroshima. News cameras captured his emergence from the jungle, still in uniform, rifle cleaned and oiled, standing at attention as his former commanding officer read him orders to stand down. But Onoda wasn't alone in his long war. He was just the most famous. Across the Pacific in the Philippines, Guam, Indonesia, isolated atolls and forgotten islands, hundreds of Japanese soldiers retreated into caves and jungles in 1945 and stayed there. Some emerged after months, others after years. A few died in their hiding places, never knowing the war had ended, their bones discovered decades later by farmers or hikers who stumbled onto caves that had become tombs. This is their story, not the story of why Japan fought or how the war ended, but what happened to the men who couldn't accept that it had. Men who chose caves over surrender, isolation over dishonor, a living death over the unbearable shame of defeat. To understand why they stayed, you have to understand what they were running from. Not just the Americans, though, the fear of capture was real, but something deeper and more terrifying. The collapse of everything they'd been taught to believe about themselves, their emperor, and their place in the universe. Japanese military culture in World War II was built on concepts that seem almost incomprehensible to Western minds. Bushido, the way of the warrior, as interpreted by the Imperial Japanese Army, demanded absolute obedience, contempt for surrender, and willingness to die rather than face capture. The field code issued to soldiers was explicit: never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor. This wasn't rhetoric. It was religion, enforced with brutal discipline and supported by everything these men had been taught since childhood. The emperor was divine. Japan's cause was sacred. Surrender was worse than death, it was spiritual annihilation. The destruction not just of yourself but of your family's honor, your ancestors' legacy, everything that gave your existence meaning. When the war turned against Japan in 1944 and 1945, when American forces began retaking islands across the Pacific, Japanese units faced an impossible choice. They couldn't win, but they couldn't surrender. So thousands chose a third option. They disappeared. Some went into the caves planning to continue guerrilla operations, expecting Japanese counterattacks that would never come. Others went simply to hide, to avoid capture until they could figure out what to do. Many went because their officers ordered them to, and in the Imperial Japanese Army, you didn't question orders, even orders that made no sense. And once they were in the caves, leaving became almost impossible. Not physically. They could have walked out at any time, but psychologically. Every day they stayed reinforced the decision to hide. Every week made surrender harder to contemplate. Every month deepened the isolation until the cave became their entire world and the war outside became an abstraction. The caves themselves were scattered across the Pacific theater, as varied as the islands that held them. Limestone caverns in the Philippines, large enough to hide platoons, with water sources and multiple chambers. Volcanic tubes in the Japanese home islands, narrow and claustrophobic. Coral caves in Pacific atolls, barely big enough for one man. Caves dug by hand in Guam and Saipan, reinforced with timber, stocked with supplies that were meant to last weeks but had to last years. Some of these caves had been prepared as defensive positions, storage for weapons and ammunition, medical supplies, rations. Others were just holes in the ground, natural shelters that desperate men claimed when their units were overrun. But all of them became prisons, chosen prisons, where men locked themselves away from a world they could no longer face. In the first weeks after Japan's surrender in August 1945, most Japanese soldiers emerged from hiding. They'd heard the emperor's radio address, or seen leaflets dropped from American planes, or been found by search parties. Surrender was shameful, but the emperor had commanded it, which made it bearable. If the divine emperor himself said the war was over, then obedience meant surrender. But some didn't hear the message. Communication in the Pacific was chaotic. Radio networks had collapsed, mail stopped, command structures disintegrated. Isolated units had no reliable information, only rumors and propaganda they'd been taught not to believe. And some heard the message but didn't believe it. The leaflets were obvious tricks, American psychological warfare. The radio broadcasts were propaganda. The emperor would never surrender, therefore any voice claiming he had must be fake. Even when fellow soldiers emerged to tell them it was over, the holdouts dismissed them as traitors, collaborators, men who'd broken under torture and been sent back to trick the faithful. This wasn't stupidity. It was logic twisted by indoctrination. These men had been taught that Americans were demonic, that they'd torture prisoners, that surrender meant degradation and death. From that premise, any evidence that the war was over could be reinterpreted as deception. The more plausible the surrender message seemed, the more sophisticated the trick must be. So they stayed in their caves waiting for orders that would never come, preparing for counterattacks that were never launched, fighting a war that existed only in their minds. The Philippine jungle was particularly dense with holdouts. The islands were huge, covered in jungle and mountains, dotted with caves. Filipino guerrillas had been hiding from the Japanese for years. Now Japanese soldiers were hiding from everyone. Some formed small groups, raiding farms for food, avoiding contact with civilians and occupying forces alike. Others went completely solo, retreating so deep into the wilderness that they saw no one for years. On Guam, American forces knew there were holdouts in the jungle. They'd seen evidence, found abandoned camps, heard shots fired at night. They sent out search parties with loudspeakers, broadcasting messages in Japanese. The war is over. Emperor Hirohito has ordered all forces to surrender. You will not be harmed. Please come out. Some did. But others fired at the search parties and melted back into the jungle. By 1950, the searches had mostly stopped. The remaining holdouts were rare enough, scattered enough, that hunting them wasn't worth the effort. They were left alone, ghosts in the jungle, living on the margins of an island that had moved on. Shoichi Yokoi lived in a cave on Guam for 28 years. When he finally emerged in 1972, he was 57 years old, emaciated, his uniform rotted away and replaced with clothes he'd woven from tree bark. He'd known the war was over for decades. He'd found newspapers, heard broadcasts, seen evidence everywhere. But he was too ashamed to surrender. I was told not to, he said simply. And I obeyed. His cave was a masterpiece of desperate ingenuity. He'd dug it himself, 3 feet high and 6 feet deep, hidden under a tangle of bamboo in a riverbank. The entrance was camouflaged so perfectly that American and Filipino search parties had walked past it dozens of times without noticing. Inside was darkness, dampness, and the smell of earth, but also safety, the one place where he controlled his environment. He'd lived on rats, frogs, eels from the river, mangoes when he could get them. He'd made traps from wire he'd scavenged, fishhooks from nails he'd found. He'd kept a calendar by scratching marks on the cave wall, though he eventually lost count and stopped caring what year it was. At night, he'd crawl out to forage, moving through the jungle like a ghost. He'd memorized the patrol patterns of Americans in the first years, then later the routines of locals who lived near his territory. He stole what he needed, a pot here, some cloth there, once a radio that gave him news he refused to believe. During the day, he stayed in the cave, sleeping fitfully, listening to the sounds of the jungle, waiting. For what? He wasn't entirely sure anymore. Orders that would never come. A Japanese counterattack that was never launched. Permission to stop hiding that he couldn't give himself. The psychological torture of this existence is almost incomprehensible. Yokoi wasn't stupid. He could see that Guam had been rebuilt, that Americans and Guamanians lived normal lives, that the war was obviously over. But accepting that meant confronting a crisis of identity so profound that hiding in a hole seemed preferable. If the war was over and Japan had lost, then everything he believed was a lie. The emperor wasn't divine. Japan wasn't invincible. His sacrifice meant nothing. His comrades had died for nothing. And worse, much worse, he'd hidden for decades for nothing. Had wasted his life in a cave because he was too cowardly to face the shame of surrender. That thought was unbearable. So he stayed in the cave, trapped by shame and pride and the terrible weight of sunk costs. Every year made it harder to leave. If he emerged after 1 year, it was a mistake. After 10 years, it was pathetic. After 28 years, it was monstrous. Better to die in the cave than face the world with that kind of failure. But Yokoi at least had a cave that was marginally livable. Other holdouts weren't so fortunate. On Anatahan, a tiny volcanic island north of Guam, 31 Japanese sailors and soldiers ended up stranded when their ships were sunk in 1944. They had no cave, no supplies, barely any shelter. The island was 5 miles long, covered in scrub and volcanic rock, with no fresh water except what they could collect when it rained. They survived anyway, building lean-tos from palm fronds, eating coconuts and fish, drinking from a small spring they discovered. And they fought not Americans who never came but each other. With no outside enemy and no mission except survival, the group turned inward, forming factions, fighting over food and water, and eventually over a woman, a Japanese civilian who'd been on the island when the war started. The woman, Kazuko Higa, became the center of the island's social dynamics and its curse. 31 men and 1 woman, alone on a tiny island for years. Inevitably, jealousy, violence, and murder followed. Over the course of 6 years, 12 men died, some from disease or accidents, but at least 5 murdered by other holdouts in disputes over Kazuko, or food, or perceived slights that festered in the isolation. When American forces finally evacuated the survivors in 1951, 6 years after the war, ended 19 men and Kazuko stumbled onto the rescue ship, half-starved and traumatized. Several were tried for murder. The story became a scandal in Japan. A glimpse into what happened when military discipline collapsed, and men were left alone too long. But Anatahan was exceptional. Most holdouts lived alone or in small groups, avoiding contact even with each other. Teruo Nakamura spent 29 years alone on Morotai Island in Indonesia, living in a hut he'd built by hand, farming vegetables in a tiny hidden clearing. He was the last confirmed holdout, discovered by accident in 1974 when Indonesian soldiers on a patrol stumbled onto his camp. Nakamura was ethnic Taiwanese, conscripted into the Japanese army, and he apparently decided that hiding in the jungle was preferable to whatever fate awaited him in the post-war chaos. He wasn't fighting anymore. He'd been farming peacefully for decades, apparently content with solitude. When the Indonesians found him, he didn't resist. He just looked confused, as if he'd forgotten there was a world outside his clearing. The caves and hideouts these men created became entire universes, microsystems with their own rhythms and rules. Hiroo Onoda, before his partners died or gave up, maintained military discipline in his camp reveille at dawn, weapons inspection, patrol schedules. They weren't just hiding. They were continuing the war as if nothing had changed, following regulations designed for an army that no longer existed. Other holdouts abandoned military structure entirely, reverting to pure survival. They forgot ranks, forgot protocols, forgot everything except finding food and avoiding capture. Their caves became burrows, places to sleep, and nothing more. They regressed, becoming feral, losing language from disuse, losing connection to their own identities. The isolation did strange things to time. Without calendars, without regular human contact, without the markers that structure normal life, days blurred together. Holdouts lost track of months, then years. Some didn't know how long they'd been hiding when they finally emerged. They'd estimate 5 years when it had been 10, or think it had been 2 decades when it had been 15. Memory became unreliable. Events from before the war, childhood, family, peacetime Japan seemed more real than the present. The cave became timeless, a suspended moment between a past that was gone and a future that never came. Some holdouts later described it as dreamlike, a fugue state where they were only half-conscious, moving through routines without thought. The physical toll was enormous. Malnutrition was universal. Jungle food kept them alive but barely. Most holdouts emerged skeletal, with tropical diseases, rotten teeth, infections from wounds that had never properly healed. Their bodies had cannibalized themselves, burning muscle for energy, weakening bones. Some were so malnourished they couldn't walk unassisted when they were found, but the psychological damage was worse. Years of isolation created minds that didn't quite work anymore. Paranoia was universal. Every sound was a threat, every encounter potential danger. Many holdouts had lost the ability to trust, to relax, to sleep without waking at the slightest noise. They'd become nocturnal, hypervigilant, incapable of peace. And they'd lost the capacity for normal human interaction. Language atrophied from disuse. Social skills disappeared. The subtle dance of conversation, the reading of facial expressions, the basic mechanics of being with other people, all of it faded. When they emerged, they couldn't make eye contact, couldn't follow conversations, couldn't understand why people weren't afraid all the time. The process of coaxing holdouts from caves became its own specialized mission. In the Philippines, the government formed teams of former Japanese soldiers who volunteered to search for their comrades. These teams would trek into the jungle with loudspeakers, camping near suspected hideouts, broadcasting messages in Japanese. The messages were carefully crafted, not orders to surrender, which might be dismissed as enemy propaganda, but personal appeals. News from home, messages from family members, updates about Japan's recovery, assurances that they wouldn't be punished, that they could go home with honor. Sometimes it worked. A holdout would hear his mother's voice on a recording, or learn that his father had died waiting for him, and the emotional dam would break. He'd emerge, often weeping, ready to finally accept what he'd been denying for years. But often it didn't work. The holdouts would hear the broadcasts and assume they were tricks, Americans using captured Japanese soldiers as bait, or actors pretending to be family members. The more elaborate and convincing the message, the more sophisticated the trap must be. It was a perfect paranoid logic, unfalsifiable, self-reinforcing. Lieutenant Onoda heard dozens of these broadcasts over the years. He found newspapers reporting Japan's surrender. He saw leaflets. He encountered search parties. He even had contact with locals who told him the war was over. He dismissed it all as deception. His orders had been to conduct guerrilla operations and wait for further instructions. Until those instructions came from his commanding officer and no one else, he would keep fighting. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had been demobilized in 1945 and was living as a bookseller in Japan. He had no idea Onoda was still in the jungle. When informed in the 1970s, Taniguchi was horrified and impressed. Onoda had followed orders with inhuman dedication for 3 decades. It was tragic, wasteful, and absurd. It was also, in a twisted way, the perfect embodiment of the military obedience Japan had once demanded. In 1974, a Japanese student named Norio Suzuki decided to find Onoda as part of a personal quest to find a panda, a yeti, and Lieutenant Onoda. He actually succeeded. He trekked into the Philippine jungle, made contact with Onoda, and convinced him that he wasn't the enemy, but Onoda still wouldn't surrender. "I will not give up until I receive orders from my commanding officer," he said. So Suzuki returned to Japan, found Major Taniguchi, and convinced him to fly to the Philippines. On March 9, 1974, deep in the jungle on Lubang Island, Taniguchi stood before his former subordinate and formally read orders relieving him of duty. Only when his commanding officer explicitly told him the mission was over, did Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda surrender. He emerged from the jungle in his uniform, rifle cleaned and oiled, sword still sharp, spare ammunition in careful order. He was 52 years old. He'd spent 29 years in the jungle. He stood at attention and saluted. He was following orders to the very end. The world was fascinated. News cameras captured every moment. Onoda became an instant celebrity, a curiosity, a symbol of loyalty or fanaticism depending on who was interpreting the story. He was interviewed, photographed, analyzed. Japan wasn't quite sure how to feel about him, embarrassed by what he represented, but also strangely proud of the dedication he'd shown. Onoda himself was conflicted. He'd done his duty, but his duty had become absurd. He'd sacrificed 30 years for a war that ended before most of those years began. He'd killed Filipino civilians in his guerrilla operations, people who weren't enemies, who were just trying to live their lives. He'd wasted his youth hiding from a world that had moved on, but he'd also kept faith. He'd maintained discipline when everything else collapsed. He'd been the perfect soldier, which meant he'd been perfectly wrong. After a brief return to Japan where he was overwhelmed by the noise, the crowds, the impossibility of recognizing the country he'd left, Onoda emigrated to Brazil and became a cattle rancher. He avoided interviews, avoided politics, tried to live quietly, but he never quite escaped the cave. In his autobiography, he described feeling like he was still in the jungle, still waiting for orders, still fighting a war that everyone else had forgotten. Shoichi Yokoi had a different reaction when he was found in 1972. His first words upon capture were, "It is with much embarrassment that I return. Not relief, not joy, embarrassment." He'd failed to die in service to the emperor. He'd hidden like a coward. He'd survived when he should have perished. In his mind, he was deeply ashamed. Japan's reaction to Yokoi was complicated. Some saw him as a hero, the ultimate loyal soldier. Others saw him as pathetic, a man who'd wasted his life hiding in a hole. The government gave him a pension, he married, he became a minor celebrity. But he was haunted by those 28 years, by the isolation and the waste and the fact that he could never get them back. He gave speeches about his experience, warning about the dangers of blind obedience. Orders are orders, he would say, but you must also think for yourself. It was a lesson learned too late, after he'd already sacrificed decades to orders that had stopped making sense before he stopped following them. The last confirmed holdout, Teruo Nakamura, had the strangest fate. When he was found in 1974, he didn't speak Japanese well, he'd been conscripted from Taiwan, and he'd forgotten most of the language during his isolation. He wasn't heroic, wasn't fighting, he was just a farmer who'd been hiding for 30 years. Indonesia didn't want to prosecute him. Taiwan didn't know what to do with him. He returned briefly to Taiwan, collected a small pension, and disappeared into obscurity. The caves themselves, the physical places where these men lived, became archaeological sites of a sort. Some were preserved as historical locations. Yokoi's cave on Guam is marked with a monument, though the actual cave was too small and fragile to keep open. Onoda's various camps in the Philippines are lost to the jungle, reclaimed by vegetation. Other caves were found decades later with artifacts still inside rusted rifles. Rotted uniforms, personal items left behind by men who died there and were never recovered. A cave on Guam yielded a skeleton in 1960. Identified eventually as a Japanese soldier who'd hidden after the war and died alone, his bones undisturbed for 15 years. These discoveries continue occasionally. In 2005, remains were found on Okinawa that DNA testing identified as a Japanese soldier who likely died in a cave in the late 1940s. 2013, a cave in the Philippines yielded artifacts suggesting someone had lived there into the 1950s, though no one knows who or what became of them. The holdout phenomenon wasn't unique to Japanese soldiers, though they're the most famous cases. German soldiers hid in the ruins of Berlin and other cities after 1945, emerging months or occasionally years later. Italian soldiers melted into the population or hid in mountains. What made the Japanese holdouts different was the duration and the motivation. They weren't just hiding from capture. They were maintaining identity, preserving a sense of purpose that couldn't exist outside their caves. In 2014, 40 years after Onoda's surrender, the Japanese government announced that it would no longer actively search for holdouts. Anyone still hiding was either dead or had been hiding so long that they clearly wanted to stay hidden. The official position was that the war was over, and it was time to stop looking backward. But the legacy of the holdouts lives on in unexpected ways. In Japan, they're studied as examples of both loyalty and the dangers of indoctrination. Their stories are taught in schools. Not as heroes, but as cautionary tales. What happens when obedience becomes absolute? When questioning orders becomes impossible. When identity becomes so fused with duty that the self disappears. Psychologists study holdout syndrome, the refusal to accept changed circumstances, the clinging to outdated beliefs, the creation of alternate realities to preserve ego and meaning. It appears in contexts beyond war, cults, political movements, personal relationships. The mechanics are similar. Reality becomes threatening to identity, so reality is denied, and an alternate version is constructed and defended with increasingly elaborate rationalizations. The caves themselves have become metaphors. Everyone lives in caves of their own, making to some degree belief systems that insulate us from uncomfortable truths, narratives we tell ourselves to make sense of chaos, walls we build between ourselves and a world that doesn't match our expectations. The holdouts just made their caves literal. When Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 at age 91, his obituaries focused on the 29 years in the jungle. But he'd lived almost 40 years after emerging. And those years were arguably more interesting, the challenge of rejoining a world that had moved on, of processing an experience that couldn't be explained, of finding meaning after dedicating yourself to a cause that had been proven wrong. He never expressed regret for following orders. But he did express sadness for what it cost, the years lost, the people hurt, the life unlived. Every Japanese soldier was prepared to die for the emperor, he said in an interview. I just happened to be prepared for a very long time. Yokoi died in 1997. Having spent his final decades as a symbol of something he never quite understood, was he heroic or foolish, admirable or pitiable? He gave different answers at different times, unable to settle on a narrative that made sense of his experience. The cave had defined him, and he could never escape that definition. The younger generation in Japan knows the holdout stories mostly as historical curiosities, almost mythical tales from a world they can't quite imagine. The idea of hiding in a jungle for decades, of fighting a war that's over, seems absurd. But the cultural undercurrents that created the holdouts' obedience to authority, fear of shame, preservation of face still exist, evolved but recognizable. The caves on Guam and in the Philippines and scattered across the Pacific are mostly empty now, reclaimed by nature or preserved as monuments. They're dark, damp places, unremarkable except for what happened inside them. They're holes in the ground that became prisons, shelters that became tombs, refuges that became hells. But they're also witnesses. They saw men choose isolation over dishonor, saw decades of waiting and doubt and slow realization that the waiting was pointless. They saw the human capacity for endurance and the terrible cost of that endurance. Every now and then, someone explores one of these caves and finds something, a button, a canteen, a mark carved in stone. Physical evidence that someone lived here, hid here, perhaps died here. The objects are put in museums or left where they are, small monuments to large tragedy. The last confirmed holdout emerged 50 years ago. The war has been over for nearly 80 years. The caves are quiet now, their stories fading. The men who lived in them are mostly dead, their experiences dying with them. But the question they embodied remains. What do you do when the world changes but you can't? When everything you believed is proven wrong, but accepting that would destroy you? When the cave literal or metaphorical offers safety at the cost of life itself? The Japanese soldiers who lived in caves for years weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were men caught in an impossible situation, making choices that seemed logical from inside a framework that was fundamentally broken. They were prisoners of ideology, of shame, of their own minds. And they were human trying to survive, trying to maintain dignity, trying to find meaning in circumstances that had none. They failed in the sense that they wasted their lives on a mission that didn't matter. But they succeeded in the only way they knew how. They followed orders, they kept faith, they endured. The caves remember them. Dark holes in tropical cliffs, silent now except for the sound of wind and water. Places where time stopped for men who couldn't let go. Where the war continued long after it ended, where loyalty became its own trap. If you visit Guam, you can see the monument to Yokoi's cave. It's a small plaque in the jungle, explaining that a man lived here in a hole for 28 years. Tour groups stop briefly, take pictures, move on. The cave itself is sealed, too fragile and too small to preserve. But you can still feel something there. Standing in the humid jungle heat, looking at that dark opening in the ground. You can imagine what it was like, the loneliness, the fear, the slow erosion of hope. You can understand maybe how a man could choose that rather than face a world where everything he believed was a lie. The cave offered certainty. Outside was chaos, defeat, shame. Inside was purpose, however hollow. And sometimes when the outside world becomes unbearable, the cave, dark and damp and isolated, seems like the only place left to go. The Japanese soldiers who lived in caves for years made that choice every day for decades. They chose the cave over the world, and the cave consumed them. Their stories are about loyalty and obedience. Yes, but mostly they're about the terrible human capacity to prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, to cling to meaning even when meaning has died. To hide from change rather than face it. We've all got our caves. Small ones, usually. Beliefs we won't question, truths we won't face, changes we won't accept. The holdouts just took it to the extreme, literalizing the metaphor until the cave became their entire universe. And when they finally emerged blinking in sunlight they hadn't seen in years, facing a world that had moved on without them, they discovered what everyone who stays in caves too long eventually learns. The world changes whether you accept it or not. The only question is whether you emerge in time to still be part of it, or whether you wait so long that when you finally come out, you're a ghost from another age, lost in a world you no longer recognize. The caves are empty now, but their lessons remain carved into stone and memory, waiting for anyone willing to descend into the dark and see what happens when human beings trap themselves between a past they cut and release and a future they cut and face.